first, thanks for the interview. It's great to be able to tell some of these stories and share them with the wider public. So the trip we took was in June of this summer. It was the first time back since COVID. And Peru had been particularly hit hard by COVID and had taken some time to recover. So we were glad to be going back as the city of Lima in particular was getting back up on its feet. And we decided to confine our trip to Lima because since we opened this restaurant, the Limenian food scene has grown and evolved to a point in a somewhat parallel process in our own evolution to becoming a really modern, very world-class dining scene compared to where it was 20 plus years ago. And so, in short, we were just blown away by what we saw down there. It was a fantastic experience to be able to see Lima and its food scene really come into its own. World-class restaurants. I think of the 50 best restaurants. I can't remember on which list it is, the Pellegrino list probably. 3 of them are in Lima, which I think puts it in a category equivalent to, say, Paris, right? So, and the food there is so varied. And again, it reflects the fact that Peru has really started to mine its food history, its past, in a way that is now really beautifully represented in the food. So just as by way of history, Peruvian food really established itself as a world cuisine during the colony, the age of the colony, the Spanish colony in Peru. And Lima was the epicenter of that colony. So all the wealth of the Americas, of South America, flowed through Lima and out to the rest of the world. And so it attracted a lot of immigrants, not just from Spain, but from all the European countries, Japan, China, of course, the tragic history of African slaves that were brought in to work the plantations on the coast after the liberation of Peru from Spanish control. Afro-Peruvians had freedom and liberty to start their own colony as well in south of Lima in a place called Chincha. That's kind of the epicenter of their culture. And so you have all of these culinary influences from all of these different immigrants coming to work and live in Peru. And they all had a time to kind of just kind of stew together, right? And so the traditional Peruvian food is what we call a cocina criolla. It's a Creole cuisine, right? Very similar to what you find in the South in that sense, right? And like in New Orleans, it's this interesting, fusion of all of these culinary influences coming together in a unique cuisine. What's happened in the last 20 to 30 years is that there's been a generation of chefs who studied abroad, went to places like London and Paris and other places to do their stages and learn from the masters of European cooking. And then they came home and they started applying those techniques to this Creole cuisine. And they started to see and pull out the threads of what's Italian, what's French, what's Spanish, what's Chinese, what's Japanese, what's African, and kind of unravel that tapestry a bit. And now that they've had time to hone their craft, what you have is a really diverse dining scene. It's all very Peruvian, but you can literally go from what seems to be, is essentially Japanese cuisine, what we call cocina Nikkei, and it's the traditional omakase or nigiri spread, but with Peruvian flavors, right, infused in them, all the way to Chinese or Chinatown-style dining halls, that Cantonese Peruvian fusion, which we call chifa, all the way to 3-star Michelin establishments, looking at using molecular gastronomic techniques to feature the foods of the all of the region of Peru. And so it's a huge spread, and it's hard to think of any other food city in the world doing that, where you have all of that spread done at a really high level of quality, plus all the traditional eating places, right, that people go to. So we just ate ourselves kind of sick, to be honest. We had a full packed itinerary every day. We were hitting at least 5 different places a day. and just going and sampling as much as we could and trying to get a sense of what Peruvian food looks like now. What's the representation of Peruvian food? Largely to serve as just inspiration for us, right? What we're trying to do here is represent, at least in some form, a portion of what is happening in Peru. We think of ourselves as being a kind of a culinary embassy, right? And a cultural embassy as well, because the culture comes through the food. So that's a very kind of background way of saying that the trip was inspirational, served as a lot of food for thought and menu development. And Victor's in charge of operations on a day-to-day basis, so he had the task of kind of whittling down, okay, with all of these menu inspirations, how do we then start to feature some of those, what we gleaned from one place or another on our menu. So you can maybe speak to that.
Yeah, thank you. I think I enjoy listening to Peter tell the story of Peru and tell other stories, because I think he's captured, there's a real dynamism to Lima and to any large city. Lima's around 10 million right now.
No, at least, officially.
But it's spread over it's in a way like Los Angeles, but much, it's one of 2 desert capitals in the world. Cairo is the next, and it's shocking to see civilization take a stand against the elements in that way. It had, like most of Peruvian coastal cities, it was built on a riparian kind of logic. It was built on a river, and that river no longer flows very, very strongly, but it's there. I think what I have extracted from my trip to Peru, and it's been a lesson that I think it's taken us, at least it's taken me as the child of my parents, to learn over 20 years, and that's that it's something that Peter has frequently remarked upon, and that culture is the most important variable within a community as well as within a community of colleagues. And so the kind of culture that we practice here at Andina is being defined every day. It's we can come up with values, and we can come up with words that we use to model our behaviors every day. Peru, there's a culture of hospitality, but it's very close to a culture of obsequious behavior that's post-colonial in its origins. It's post-colonial as well as there's a very strong Catholic authoritarian structure that I think lives in people's minds. And I think what I've enjoyed doing is going back to Peru and seeing how the cosmopolitan spirit and the spirit of indigenous pride has really started to push against all of those structures and create something beautiful. And I think that's what we're seeing is the most exciting restaurants are those that are just a little bit beyond what's comfortable for Peruvians. They are serving food that some Peruvians would say is not Peruvian. It's something else. It's Central, Kyol. One of the best restaurants we ate at was the project of a Venezuelan chef, and he has learned Peruvian cuisine in his own tongue, and it's wonderful to see. I think here at Andina, the legacy of that trip from Peru, it was the first time I had been back in about 20 years. The last time was with Peter when we went to look for a chef, and it was a coming of age for myself, I think for Andina, insofar as I relate to it, in that growing up we were the children of 2 idealists, and they came of age, at least intellectually, during the tumult of Vietnam, and Peru was coming out of really kind of radical swings between left and right, between communist and quasi-fascist and
military dictatorships.
And my mom and dad fell in love with the spirit of reform, leftist reform, and I think we were brought up with a sense of doing good, but we were also brought up with a sense of the kind of anxiety that permeates Peru today, and that's that of vulnerability, of precariousness, and so I think what we've learned is that really to do good for others, you need to learn how to kind of take care of yourself first. You need to learn how to take care of an organization. You need to learn to have, at times, to have limits, and because those limits are honoring other people's ability to do good work as well. And above all, it's the culture that I think I would love to take everyone here at Andina to Peru. Not because Peruvians in and of themselves have something objectively better to show us, but the more we see, I think the better we are as curious and empathetic people. And a restaurant you couldn't ask for a worse business idea than a restaurant in some ways. Like, who wants to throw a dinner party for 200 people every night?
Right.
But it's also a stage for learning how to work with a team and to do it in a way that doesn't take advantage of anyone's either of anyone's biases or of anyone's vulnerabilities. And I think that's what's been the greatest lesson for possibly for us as a family, is that it's worth doing. It's good work.
I think that's well said. Two things that resonated with me specifically were in Peru, what we witnessed was a lot of pride, particularly in the food culture there, the food scene. Just a lot of pride in execution, in service, and especially in the storytelling. Because this is, interestingly enough, Peruvian food in this modern iteration is a way to tell the story of the country in a different way, and to appreciate specifically the indigenous and native influences when it comes to ingredients specifically, in a way that has oftentimes been discounted by the official version of history. And so that I think has been a really big shift for Peruvian society, to see that food and Peruvian cuisine can become a vehicle for that societal change. It's really unique. I don't have any other examples to go on, but it's certainly happening in Peru in a way that's really fascinating. And the other theme that Victor touched on that really resonates for me is the theme of dialogue. That ultimately a restaurant is a platform for dialogue of all kinds, right? In our case, between two cultures, right? The cultures of my mom and dad, respectively. My dad's from Portland, my mom's from Peru. There's a dialogue there going on between Peru and Portland that happens to occur here. And then also internally within any restaurant, there are all of these dialogues that are happening at the actual dinner table, right? We facilitate human interaction. That's what we do for a living. And dialogues also just how to make a restaurant more and more workable, because restaurants are just a kind of a nutty business. Razor thin margins, crazy hours, a ton of labor thrown into just getting the basic prep done so that you can actually begin to cook and serve, and of course, oftentimes volatile relationship with customers and the public, because you're trying to please everybody at the same time. It's really asking a lot of a business, and yet because it's so rich with human interaction and dialogue, it is kind of addictive. It is fun and never boring, for sure, and exhausting, and all of those things all at once. So, yeah, the fact that we've lasted 21 years is, I think, a testament to either masochism or stubbornness or something. I don't know exactly what it is, but we're still here, right? And we're still doing what we're doing because it means something to us, right? Yeah.
I think Peter should tell the origin story of our relationship with Stefan Vedersky and his cooperative in Chincha Alta, which is south of Lima by about 2 hours. And that's literally the source of our ajíes, because that story then leads into efforts to source locally. with farms, historically a farm in Corvallis, but now more and more farms who starting to feel the market interest in ajíes, including the New York Times, which just wrote a very long, beautiful piece about the ají amarillo.
It's a great article. Yeah.
But I will say that it's hard to bring Peru here. It's a very different country. You go there and you feel, just as you do walking in a field in Oregon, you feel the terroir, you feel a placeness. And in Peru, it's there. And it's an incredibly dry desert and an incredibly large mountain range and a pretty vast jungle basin. And how to source for that in the Pacific Northwest is an issue, but it's a fruitful one also.
Mm-hmm. I think the way we had to tackle this was kind of in how would I say, the challenge really for any world cuisine to export itself to a new environment is a challenge of how to source the ingredients, right? And not just source them, but then eventually get them into the local food supply. And usually I think that process just takes decades, takes a generation or two. And it typically follows the pattern of immigration, right? A large diaspora of Italians moved to New York City, right? And they set up shop there. The first generation maybe opened some mom and pop places, and then the second generation might take them over and sort of improve them, expand them. And by that time, you start to see, those ingredients start to show up in not just specialty stores, but in sort of the mainstream, and eventually it becomes integrated, right? And then there's a pizza shop at every corner in New York City, right? That kind of thing. That's kind of the typical trajectory. Peruvian food is a little different in that sense because there isn't a large Peruvian diaspora, certainly not in Portland. I think my mom knows literally like every Peruvian in Portland. It's not that many. So we've had to we've had to in some ways fast track that process by being very direct in our sourcing and very intentional in how we work on developing a local supply. It isn't just happening. We're making it happen, and this restaurant is a driver for that. So, when we opened, there's a one-floor establishment in this building. We absolutely did not even give enough thought to the sourcing challenges. We thought, there are local Latin food stores, and we can grab what we need from there. And we quickly got to a point where I was literally driving from like Eugene to Seattle, up and down the I-5 corridor, ransacking all the local bodegas and just pulling all the Peruvian product literally just off their shelf and into a cart. And then we would have to just unpack it, these tiny little glass jars of ají amarillo paste, and it was nuts. And I was like, this is not sustainable. It just can't work like this. So it got to a point where I was reaching out through our vendor network, and someone mentioned some food broker in San Francisco. And so I gave him a call. His name was Tom Payne. And I said, Tom, your name has come up. Somebody I should talk to about sourcing Peruvian ajíes. Ajíes are what you see here, the hot peppers of Peru, which are the flavor base for the cuisine. And he said, oh, funny enough, I've been working with a guy. His name is Stefan Baderski. He's a German-Peruvian family of farmers south of Lima, and they're trying to break into the American market with their dry peppers. But he grows anything down there, so I'll just connect you. You guys should talk. And so we connected by email. I spoke with him by phone. He speaks excellent English because he'd been educated at Cal Poly, got his PhD there. And so I just flew down, and he picked me up, and Victor was with me on that trip. He picked us up, or we met for I think it was a meal at the local tennis club or something weird like that in Chincha. He drove up in this dusty Volkswagen, jacked up Volkswagen Bug, because he's got all Volkswagens on his farm. And we just did kind of a handshake deal. It's like, you grow it, we buy it. And that became the basis of his first U.S. customer. We basically opened the market to him. And there was a lot of experimentation about how best to send the product. We eventually hit upon a culinary paste, where because of FDA restrictions, we can't import any of these whole ajíes fresh. because Peru is still dealing with what are known as whitefly infestations. And so it has to be either frozen or it has to be processed or brined or otherwise, processed. And so we decided, okay, we're going to work with a newly opened organic processor in Lima. We would buy his entire harvest. He'd load up a truck, take it into that processor. And then in order to render this ají into usable form, you'll see this in the New York Times article, they do a great job of it. You have to blanch it in a hot water bath to kill the spice, peel it, de-seed it, devein it, and then puree it. Sometimes you even toast it, or you put it in a wok to kind of get some of the volatile oils off of it and give it more of a smoky flavor. And then you puree it into what is this just brilliant yellow golden paste. And that is literally the DNA of Peruvian food. It's this bright, fruity, yummy flavor that comes from this pepper in particular. And it's spooned into what's known as the aderezo, or the vegetable or olive oil, onion, garlic, plus the Peruvian ají paste spooned in. That's your flavor base, and you layer that then in all your cooking. And this is in 90% of what we cook, ají amarillo. But there are a bunch of other ajíes, right, that are used again for flavor, less for heat, more for flavor. The heat's there, but there's a specific flavor to all of these different varietals. And so anyways, we still, to this day, we still get shipments of ají paste, vacuum sealed into bags, put into boxes, put onto pallets, shipped up here, right, through a broker in Seattle. And that is our lifeblood of the restaurant. But because of, just the way that shipping goes, there's a strike of the longshoremen in Peru. There's COVID, which interrupted our entire supply chain. So we've recognized, and it's expensive, right, to ship this product. So we realized a while ago that we're better off also cultivating relationships with local farmers. But then you have to adapt this desert pepper, which is used to growing at about a latitude of 25 or 30 degrees, to a 45-degree latitude in Oregon, right, in the valley, where it frosts. And so we, luckily, again through serendipity, having grown up in Corvallis, we're connected to a family of farmers there, a Capular family. Al Capular is kind of this very well-known, recently passed away, but very well-known seed farmer, open source seed farming, so the opposite of Monsanto's, right? And he happened to have a particular passion for Andean products. And we were connected through family connections. My mom said, "Oh, I just recently ran into the Capular you should talk with." So I called up Al and drove down to Corvallis and met with him. And he introduced me to this monograph called The Lost Crops of the Incas. I think you can get it still on Google Books. It's out of publication, but just go online. And it's, it's this thick. It's a thick publication. National Academy of Sciences printed it. And they had done an intensive study of all the crops that had been domesticated by pre-Incan and Incan civilizations in Peru. And it's vast. It revealed the ancient Peruvians, in Al's own words, to have been the master plant breeders of the world. He's like, there's more germplasm that they domesticated and learned how to turn into usable foodstuffs than anywhere else on earth. It's the gift from the Andes to the world. So of course, potatoes are the classic one, right? Peru has 700 edible varieties, right? It's just astounding how, the incredible variety they have there. And then there are all the cousins to the potatoes, the root crops, mashua, yacon, oca, uyuco, cañiwa, there's a ton of them. And they're all different, right? There are things that people have never tried here. And then on top of that, the cereal crops, quinoa, amaranth, right? And then there are all these edible bean varieties. It's astonishing how much food comes out of Peru that is now eaten worldwide. Of course, all the nightshade, the tomatoes are a product of the Andes. All hot peppers come from the Andes. It's incredible. So, and it was just eye-opening for me. I was like, oh my gosh, wow. And he's like, yeah, and we grow this stuff on my seed farm just right up the road here. So I said, well, would you be willing to try and grow this? Because we need a lot of this. And so it took them about 6-7 years of hybridizing and patient seed selection of the different ones, the plants that happen to fruit and then grow, and then you cross those with the other ones, and eventually they were producing fruiting ají amarillo plants and crossbreeding them even with a smaller pepper called ají limo, which is this one, for hardiness. And now we're harvesting fresh harvest. It's the harvest tends to come late here, but it's basically October, so in a couple weeks we'll be harvesting from their farm. And so now we've been getting our other growers through our mainline vendors interested in this and interested in buying their seed, which is again the good stuff that's adapted to our climate, so we can grow even acres of this. So that's been a long project, right? Again, to get Peruvian food to grow here, and so that more and more people can experience it, right? And I think that again just shows we've fast-tracked, we've kind of accelerated the natural course of evolution, right? For exporting a cuisine.
Growing up, my dad would always, one of the things he was a fairly reserved man, but sometimes he would give us advice and he'd sort of acknowledge that he was telling you something that he felt was important. He said, beware of fads, beware of trends. And I think there's we entered into this project of Andina with a few ideas, but like a lot of restaurants, no real plan, no real, we didn't have a lot of experience. We had no experience. And I think we could have clung to what was fashionable. It's hard to be fashionable with Peruvian cuisine because Peruvian cuisine is by definition at that time was not fashionable. I think this was an opportunity, Andina has always been an opportunity for us to work out some of our own questions of identity. And identity and authenticity are interwoven. It's hard to be authentic to a cuisine because the cuisine itself is complicated and has multiple stories being told about it. Some of our harshest critics are Peruvians because they want food to taste like it tasted to them in Peru, and that's great feedback for us to have. But what it means to be authentic is it's to always be asking questions about whether the way in which we're representing the food and ourselves is aligned with all of our other values and is in some way ultimately about empowerment, I think. I was thinking about when we were discussing sort of the cultural dimensions of a restaurant. I think one of the ways in which it's distinctive and really complicated is that there's not a lot of power that accrues to the service industry and insofar as kind of social recognition. There's power that accrues to the legal profession and to the medical profession and to the professions and I think through one lens there's a kind of perverse sort of power relationship between client and servant. But that applies to theater as well, and it applies to the arts. And I think there's a similar dynamic happening in restaurants where there's a desire to be authentic to the created spirit. And you don't know exactly where that's going to take you, but as long as you keep asking yourself if are you doing it for that reason, then you're doing it for the right reason, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's well said. I think there's an authenticity trap, I think, particularly that happens with minority populations here in the United States, where there's a sense that, well, you're this, you're Peruvian, or you're Mexican, or you're Chinese, whatever it is, and that means this. That means you do these things, right? Because we all operate with those sort of categories in our mind, and it can be a trap in terms of identity because there's a performative element to identity at all times for everyone. And certainly so if you're if you feel like, oh, I have to behave or I have to, belong to this group in this particular way. And I think what we helped hopefully provide a little bit more insight into is that the Latino population in United States is incredibly diverse. It's not a monolith at all, right? Each of these countries in Latin America, through Central and South America, Spain included, are very different from one another. It's different as the United States is from Australia or New Zealand, right? I mean, just same language, different culture, different foods, different way of doing things, right? And so by being Peruvian in a very, in a town that doesn't have a lot of Peruvians, we were, in some ways, it gave us a little bit more freedom because a lot of people genuinely and just very honestly asked, where's Peru? And what's the food? I've never had it before. So we were kind of free to define ourselves on our own terms and define Peruvian food for a Portland audience, kind of largely uninhibited, right? Except for the lack of ingredients, right? So that was that. I think that's been a really fun process for the family and for my parents in particular, because that's part of their story. They had always tried to blend both cultures. That was kind of how they approached their family life, right? And this became a stage to do that in. And particularly for my mom, who's the native-born Peruvian. I was born in Peru too, but my mother lived there. And so she saw this as an opportunity again to represent, right, her country, her culture. And as she said, her own personal mission was to break stereotypes. She's like, there are too many stereotypes about what being a Latina is or what being from South America is. And she's like, I want to break these stereotypes. I want to have direct relationships with everyone so they get to know me, and by extension our family in this restaurant on our own terms, right? And I think it was also a point of pride here, as it is in Peru, to say, look, these cultures or countries that are oftentimes, frankly, kind of looked down upon in the sense that they're the third world or the developing world, have so much to give, and where their cuisines can compete with the best in the world, right? So that's a particular point of pride, I think. And so there's a lot that comes up around that word authenticity, but I think it really, as Victor said, is you got to be true to yourself, and you see that theme playing out throughout the food world, because food is a great way to express yourself, and it's a great way for people to get to know you or your approach to things, your culture, because the dialogue is facilitated by deliciousness, right? You don't have to speak the language necessarily, you just open your mouth and enjoy, right? And so I think that's a great way to kind of to open up people's minds a bit.
I'll give you an example. My parents came in on Saturday to have dinner, and we have a young chef from the Caribbean side of Colombia, the country of Colombia. He was born in Barranquilla, but cooked in Bogota in a Peruvian restaurant, and so has been to Peru and has eaten at some of Peru's iconic restaurants. And like a lot of South Americans, is very interested in Peruvian cuisine, but as an expression as well of a kind of pan-South American, but specifically kind of Andean Cordillera, where the Andes intersect with what at the time were different parts of the Spanish kingdom. So he brings some Caribbean memorial kind of instincts with him, and he's very open about how much he misses home and how much when he cooks, he's often cooking with home in mind, and you have to in order to create a compelling life as well as a compelling dish. And so he had prepared for my parents a kind of a preview of a dish that we just launched yesterday, and it was a ceviche de pescado, a rockfish ceviche with fermented pineapple leche de tigre. So it's pineapple that's been lacto-fermented and then blended into traditional leche de tigre, which is tiger's milk, and it's It's the kind of sweet, savory liquid that's left over after you allow fish to marinate in lime juice and onion and salt. And it's kind of
Literally, the figure means tiger's milk.
it's a tonic, a cure-all, a kind of. So he presented this dish as kind of both a preview, but as well as a welcome. And I was bracing for. My mom is very traditional. She comes from at elevation, and so ceviche was not part of her childhood. And if asked to choose between a stew and a ceviche, she would choose a stew. And the tropical flavors, I think, were jarring to her. The Caribbean notes were jarring to her, but it was a perfect opportunity for her to learn about what Peruvian cuisine might look like now, and for Jose, our chef, to learn what Peruvian cuisine still means to some people, and how do we have a conversation that allows for both of those things to be true and
to appreciate where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Right?
And
Yeah.
so we talk all the time with our kitchen, yeah.
I think, when we put together this list of values, we did so partly because we felt it was important to ground our everyday work with our team in some core principles, some core values. But also, it was at a time when we were, like any organization, you got into scale pre-COVID, and we needed to be able to communicate in shorthand what we're now being able to communicate sort of in long form, right? We're having these rich conversations and unpacking ideas and histories and all that. So curiosity for me is just literally what we exist to do, which is to open people's minds a little bit. Just like try something new, right? And it could be our own minds, like my parents and I and Victor, even we all have different palates and we all like different things, and the same thing goes for our kitchen and our staff. And so we should all lead with curiosity is the whole point of that, right? The idea being, instead of, why do you like that? It's more like, oh, that's curious, like, tell me more about that, right? And then out of that curiosity, theoretically at least, you get new ideas and innovation, and maybe a new new dish gets discovered, and you want to put it together and put it out there, and then see what the guests think of it, right? So it's just kind of it's natural to this industry and this particular world we live in. We got to remain curious, otherwise we have nothing new to offer. So yeah. I'm just going to give a little brief history because this is fascinating. So Peru is one of these, again, classified until recently at least as an ethnic cuisine, in the sense that it's not mainstream, and like many cuisines that did not evolve in the Mediterranean, wine growing basin, right, or grape growing basin, the winemaking world evolved independent of the wine, right? It's not like traditional French cuisine or Italian specifically, highly regional, highly specific wine varietals matched with different dishes and these classical pairings. Peruvian food did not have that base, or rather, it did originally, and then it was taken away. So, interesting bit of history. Peru, as well as Mexico, are actually excellent wine growing regions. In Peru, mostly because wine tends to be defined topographically, right, by its terroir. Peru has the entire Andean span, right, which goes from sea level up 23,000 feet down into these three ranges, so these inter-Andean valleys. So most of Peru's arable land is in terraces. This is crazy. I don't think there's anywhere else in the world that's like that. Literally, it's mostly, those arable hectares are terraced and they're vertically defined. And so you couldn't think of a better wine growing situation, because you can literally just terrace your wines all the way up and down these hillsides and get different varietals growing, et cetera. So Peru has a huge potential in that sense. But in the early days of the colony, the Spanish had brought grapes and were cultivating grapes for their own, recreational uses, but also ecclesiastical purposes, because the church, of course, needs wine for mass and all these other things. So, but long story short, they were so good at it in both Mexico and Peru that they were out-competing the Spanish wine merchants. And they complained to King Charles something or other, and he passed an edict that said outlawed the growing of grapes for wine in both Peru and Mexico. Bizarre, right? And it led to then the growing, except for ecclesiastical purposes. So then it led Peruvians to innovate and start the first it was the oldest distillery still in the New World, making pisco, which is Peru's native grape brandy. And it's a beautiful product. It's actually one of the fastest growing new spirits in the American market because it's incredibly versatile, just like most grape-based or wine-based drinks are. They're very versatile. Long story short, pairing wines for Peruvian food is a really interesting project, culinary project, because you have this very broad palette, again, going from like sushi all the way to like, French-style bisques. I mean, you have a big palette and Italian flavors. You have got a lot to paint with. And so it presents a great pairing opportunity for a really experienced wine director or sommelier. And we were lucky enough in Andina's early history that a wine director, or the wine director for the country's largest wine collection, wine list, an iconic steakhouse called Burns Steakhouse in Tampa, Florida. They have over 500,000 bottles in storage. It's an enormous wine list. He had 14 sommeliers working for him at the restaurant. It's insane. So he happened to come out here to Portland for the Pinot Festival or something, and happened to come to Andina and dropped his card off. He said, I'm thinking of moving to Portland. I'm burnt out. I'm done with the whole Tampa scene. I'm going to come here and move with my wife, who's a classical musician. She got a job offer at the Portland Symphony. If you're interested, give me a call. And we did, and we hired him. And his name's Ken Kalura. He's retired. I think he DJs one of the jazz radio stations now. Jazz is his other passion. But he basically said, I'm just going to start writing the book on Peruvian wine pairings, right? For all the classic Peruvian dishes, from causas to lomo saltado to ceviches. I mean, all of these de secos, all of these classic preparations of Peruvian food and kind of the Creole tradition. And he took copious notes, went about it in a very systematic fashion. And because of his reputation and wine knowledge, we just started winning a ton of wine spectator awards, right? As a result of this, largely because we were literally one of the first Peruvian restaurants in the States to do this, and possibly outside of Peru, for all we know. So it still remains a really interesting opportunity, because, like I said, it's such a diverse cuisine. It's not monotone. I love Italian cuisine. I love French cuisine. They don't have a very broad palette. It's very nuanced, but it plays within this range. Peruvian food plays in this range. It's got huge variety, right? And so it's exciting for people who know wine.
I think that's still revealing itself to us. I think we have two dynamic programs that we could spend years on perfecting here. And one is the menu and the experience that we offer to guests who eat a la carte and traditionally, and then there's another that we serve to our guests, or that we present to our guests who choose a private dining setting. And any variations between those two, from invitational dinners in a space like this with so much potential to educate, to celebrate. But if the creative urge strikes and we feel like future projects that might lead us outside of these four walls, then that's, I think, something we're all open to.
Yeah, and I think, we did experiment with that already, with a concept we've been noodling on for a while pre-COVID, and then had an opportunity to launch during COVID, when we had finally gotten permission from the city to build our back patio, our outdoor patio. Before any restaurant was allowed to serve indoors, we were given permission to serve outside. So we decided to use that opportunity to launch what we call our chicha concept. Chicha is a Quechua word, which is the language of the Incan Empire, still spoken widely in the Andes of Peru. But it's also come to mean chicha originally means corn beer, which is kind of the original hooch, in the Andes. They've been made and consumed for over 10,000 years, right? This is a very ancient beverage, but has since come to mean something cultural as Andean natives migrated to Lima in particular, on the coast. They brought with them their traditions, their musical styles, their clothing, their artistry, and it collided with urban modernity, and the fusion of those two became known as chicha culture, which is really colorful and funky and has its own musical idiom and even like a graffiti script that goes along with it. It's really fascinating. So we basically plumbed that to create this brand that was essentially a Peruvian street food, right? Kind of fun, funky Peruvian street food. And it did very well as a pop-up. We had it on the back patio. Eater, gave us the Pop-Up of the Year award. So we've kept that on ice since, waiting for an opportunity in this post-COVID world, once we've kind of normalized, our operations with Andina, to take that concept and grow it, right? And find a few locations around town, because it's a bit more accessible, it's a lower price point, it's faster food, still delicious, still built on the same flavor profile and all that, yeah. But for Andina right now, this is all about, its stabilization in this new normal post-COVID. And again, rebuilding around the fundamentals of strong team, a focus on what we call inward hospitality, right? And getting that foundation really solid before we venture to grow any further.